Hello, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us here at Page Turners Plus. The last time you saw us, the full group was reflecting on Lauren Francis-Sharma's The Book of the Little Axe. Well, today we have Lauren Francis-Sharma with us, and we'll be interviewing her on her wonderful novel. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I guess we could just get straight into the heat of it. So, this is a very similar question to what we started with on our reflections. And I wanted to know, why did you choose to focus the novel on a family of free people of color after the British seizure of Trinidad?
Yeah. I wrote my first book, Till the Well Runs Dry, about sort of my grandmother in Trinidad in sort of the 1940s through the 1960s. And during that book tour, I had a lot of questions about the people that showed up in the book. People were sort of like not quite understanding how diverse a country Trinidad was. And it got me really thinking about the past and how Trinidad became what it was or what it is today. So I started to do my own research and found some, pretty interesting things. Not things that I didn't know, but things that I thought other people might not have known. But I didn't think I wanted to write a whole book about it. I didn't think I could actually do it. But one day I was listening to a radio program here in the States, and they were interviewing a country western star, Willie Nelson, and Willie was talking about like the way he makes music, and he was strumming his guitar, and I was thinking about my parents playing country western music in the house because that's what West Indians do sometimes, and I had this really interesting thought about this girl and horses, and I was like, where is she? And it's amazing how these things sort of pop into your mind. But I got very curious, and I came home and I grabbed like my books from Eric Williams had written, and I started to like, okay, why am I seeing this girl? Who is this? What year is this? Is it possible that there were free people of color in Trinidad and in the late 1700s? And as I began to dig around, I was like, yeah, oh, this is possible, and I'm gonna try this, even though I was very scared. I was very scared, but I wanted to explore this idea that the islands had been a place where people were there before Christopher Columbus came, right? And that there was a long and interesting history of colonialism that really influenced the way that we live today.
And just as a sort of brief follow up, in our discussion, we sort of all agreed that we've never read any historical fiction before that was centered on free people. It was always like the enslaved people. So was that like a sort of conscious decision? You're like, yeah, I'm definitely going to go on along that path rather than going where everyone else has gone before.
Yeah, I do think that we can get a little fatigued with slavery novels, and that's not to say that there's not a place for it and that we don't need to know as many stories as we can, but there is something very, I think, empowering and maybe interesting. I think maybe a little intriguing to see how free people of color operated in these places that were very precarious. I mean, as you know, you've read the story, but there are so many moments of danger for free people of color. Are you really free? And I think I really wanted to sort of explore what freedom meant for people at that point, despite the fact that they weren't in shackles per se.
Yeah. Paula?
Yeah, you start the novel by showing us Lyquin and Victor intentionally violating an important astrological taboo. Um, was the violation of the taboo merely a narrative device, or did you want to invite your readers to think about tensions between ego and responsibility, or maybe something else?
Yeah, I love this question. It's sometimes when you're writing, you don't necessarily know what you're doing at first. You're putting it on the page, and then as I was reading it and rereading it, I realized that I was actually sort of foreshadowing what was going to happen to Victor in particular. And I think that indigenous rituals are very important to this book, to these particular people in this culture, and breaking them has consequences. And I think Victor clearly suffered the consequences. Obviously, it's a narrative device, right? I mean, like you set off something like this, and it allows the story to sort of move. Now, what happens after they break this taboo? Oh, then this other thing happens, and this other thing happens. But there's a larger um, I think, symbolism in this, in that, this young boy who feels very out of place, sort of doesn't get the same breaks that the other boys get, even when he breaks the rules. And so this whole idea of how free are we?
Yeah. I was just thinking about what you just said, and I'm trying to like formulate my next question. I've been really interested in the kind of Black Seminole Wars, and these kind of links between African Americans who were enslaved and Native Americans. And I wondered if you considered including Maroons in your narrative, because obviously you've told this story about the relationship between these Native peoples and uh, people of African descent. Um, there's two questions there. I hope you can like pull them out.
I think I did think of it. I thought, I need to keep something for another book. But I think, yeah, I wanted to really. I don't necessarily know that I got to explore all the various ways that, Native Americans and African Americans and people of African descent sort of created communities or didn't create communities. It's very, very complex. There were Native American tribes that had slaves. There were Native American tribes that welcomed blacks into their communities. There were Native American tribes that did not want blacks in their communities. I happened to find when I was sort of doing all this research, I knew that I wanted to take my main character Rosa from the Caribbean. Something was happening in the Caribbean, and I needed her to move. And the question is where is she going? And where is going to be a safe place for her to go to? Because slavery's raging in most of what was then the United States of America, or actually just America, and there's a whole other part of North America that isn't part of the U.S. yet. And so I kind of thought to myself, I wonder what's happening in these places. Could she go to this place or a place further west, and be safe? And so when I was doing my research, I came across this character, this real life person named Edward Rose. And he was a black man who lived with the Osalake tribe, the Crow tribe, and he was a chief. And I thought to myself, well, wow, okay. And then I got like a bio of him, and he's like this big, strong, strapping dude, and he's very brave, and there's and he's also very he was a very good sort of guide for a lot of sort of the Europeans who are coming into the North America to sort of do trading, and so he knew his way around. Very capable, and yet in many of these books he was disparaged. They didn't like this black man. He knew too much, so they would go back, and they would have found their goods, and he would have gotten them where they wanted to be, and they would go and they would write about him and say, he's arrogant and he's this and he's that, and they were speaking very negatively about him. And luckily, the biography that I found was written by this man who could kind of see what was happening. Like, he didn't say that it was racism, but it was very clear that these men did not like the way that he held himself in the world. So I thought to myself, well, isn't this interesting? What if I had my character meet up with this real human being, and therein lies sort of that first, that big chunk of the beginning of the story.
So, all your protagonists are neither fish nor fowl. For example, as free people of color in a society which enslaves Africans, the Rendon's security is never guaranteed. Victor is a black boy being raised up Solaga. Rosa is never able to accept the confinement of gender roles. Craydon Rampley is racially ambiguous, and his mother may have been Absolga. What is it about people who don't fit comfortably into designated boxes that interests you?
Hmm. First of all, can I say that neither fish nor fowl is? I'm only going to hear this with the West Indian crew. So Never in my US interviews do I get neither fish nor fowl, so I completely appreciate this. I will say that I don't know, I think there's this. Yeah, I have two young kids and or teenagers, and there's this idea that everything that they're experiencing and living through and the discomfort that they're feeling is new, and none of this is new. This idea that we are living in a world where people didn't blend cultures um, is not new. Like none of this is new. If you look at Trinidad itself, if you look at the Caribbean all down the line, if you look at the way that we celebrate each other's various cultures and foods and all of that, like we have been blending and mixing forever, right? And this sense of sort of individualism and isolationism is not ours. Um, that's not our cultural paradigm. So this didn't seem completely unusual for me, and probably won't in any books that I read. My life is diverse. The way that I live is diverse. The way that my characters live, it involves lots of people from lots of different places and cultures and thinking. And I love that about books. And I don't know if I could write anything different. But there's also this sense that, and the second part of your question was about sort of fitting in comfortably. And I don't know. I don't think that. I think as a child of immigrants here in the U.S., I think I know intimately what it feels like to sort of live in one way in my house and then have to live a different way outside of my house. I don't know if I've ever felt like I fit in any place. I don't think that. I don't think many of us do. To be honest with you, I mean, maybe. I mean, I guess there's some lucky people out there that just feel like everywhere they belong, they sort of everywhere they are, they sort of belong. But I've always sort of felt like I've had to find my way through, like a self-discovery process. And I think Rosa is discovering herself. Victor is discovering himself. I think even the parents in this story are discovering themselves. So.
The novel is set in an era where there are huge political changes in Trinidad and also huge political changes in what would eventually become the Western territory of the United States. And the characters are profoundly affected by all of these events. But the novel concentrates more on personal relationships, intimate relationships between the characters, rather than these monumental political changes that are happening. Why were you more focused on the personal than on the political?
Yeah. Um, hmm. First of all, I couldn't write an 800-page book. They wouldn't let me. When you only have two books, they won't let you write 800 pages. No. But seriously, I think that there are so many so many books that have been written about the political upheaval during this time, both in the United States and in the Caribbean, all that sort of affected. And I don't know necessarily if all of them have been done well, but I know that they exist. What I didn't see in my research was us, right? And like, I think when I was doing, sort of looking at all these sort of old documents written by sort of the colonialists during the time, and they were writing home, they were writing letters back home, and they were talking about sort of the upheaval and the heat and the political this, and and all the work that they have to do, even though half of them weren't really doing work. I think that it occurred to me that there's so much missing from this story. There were no Black people mentioned in these letters. It was almost like we weren't there when we know we were there, right? And so what was the life like for these people who were unheard of, unspoken of, just taken for granted? They had families, they had relationships, they had children that they loved, they had work that they needed to do. They had dreams. So so as much as I wanted to, I got so excited. There were things that I found that I wanted to put into the book, but there was also a part of me that wanted to focus on the little people, so to speak, the everyday people who were inhabiting these places that just are not on any pages, not many pages, I should say.
I
Yes,
mean,
so
as a historian who's taught on Westward expansion and has taught early Caribbean history, I and who uses historical fiction in her classes because I think, as you say, you bring to life those parts of the story that we don't always find in the historical documents. I really appreciated it. And I think you did a fantastic job of doing that and of illuminating a period that we know so little about, really, in our grand narratives of the world and the Caribbean and even the US. But I'm going to ask a question, not just comment. So one of the things that we talked about in our review is that we really enjoyed kind of having this father-daughter relationship as central to a novel from the Caribbean. I think we were saying we don't think there's a lot of novels, if any, that we've read, and that's not to say we've read all the novels from the Caribbean, right? But just the ones that we've read together. It was quite an unusual family dynamic that was both really strong as a relationship, but also very central to the narrative of the novel. Um, but there are also some really difficult family relationships in the novel as well. And did you consciously choose to explore those? And if so, why?
Huh. Yeah, I think I did. I think that I mentioned that I have two girls myself, and when I was reading or writing this book and doing the research, I was in the throes of sort of, my own parental turmoil, maybe. Just thinking about what it means to raise people, um, and to raise human beings and all that comes with that. Nobody ever tells you how how hard this is. And yeah, so I think I was really trying to, like, myself. I was exploring like the parental side and also being a daughter. And I got to really work through. I think a lot of things in this narrative, just thinking about myself in both of those two places and thinking about Rosa. I mean, one of the things about her is that you get to see her as a child, in relation to her parents. You get to see sort of how this person is molded, and then you see her as an adult woman also trying to sort of take some of the things she's learned from her own life, from her own childhood, and give it to her child, who's rejecting it very often. And but also realizing that, like, she has to do it differently and she has to do it better. And I don't know, I mean, isn't that what we're all trying to do? I think, like, trying to, like, take what we can from what we've learned and what we've been given and pass it on, but also make it better. I mean, I think that's our goal. And so I really wanted to explore that. I wanted the relationship. Rendon Damas is like my favorite character. This is the father. Um, he's probably my favorite character because he's so, to me anyway, he's a very complex man. And he's stern and he's loving and he's done some things that feel very shameful. And then he's done some things that, that she also can be very proud of as the daughter of this man. And I did want to focus on this relationship between father and daughter, but I also wanted to focus on writing a Black man on the page that felt whole and loving, and also, complex. Yeah, complex. And I worked really hard at trying to make sure that he felt good to her, Rosa, thinking back on it, knowing that she's, not to give anything away, but she's she's probably never going to see this man again. What does she carry with her?
and you mentioned something quite interesting there in your answer that I kind of want to quiz, if I put it, quiz you on. So you
Yeah.
mentioned like passing on learned experiences. I wanted to speak briefly on like the tradition of oral history and listening to what our elders say, and that's sort of how we pass on the the traditions that they had and the experiences that they had as well. And in the novel, we have this situation where Rosa finds it quite difficult at first to tell Victor about her troubled life, and as troubled as it may be, it could very well entail a lot of historical facts about the time that when she lived in Trinidad. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the tradition of oral history, and how did that play out in writing your novel? That's quite a long run up, but yes.
No, it's great. Yeah, I think that we can get so caught up in actual writing and what's on the page. I think that one of the beautiful things about writing this book was seeing how many commonalities there are in the indigenous communities, right? I mean, I was focusing on sort of this Native American community, but there are so many similarities in the way that Rosa was sort of raised, and the way that she's in this community, that she's raising her son, and that includes sort of storytelling, right? The book sort of opens up with a little bit of a story, a Native American story, and the entire tale that she eventually tells Victor, even though it takes her a while, is an oral narrative of her life. There are stories interwoven in this entire book, and the book, if it didn't need to be on paper, would have been great as an oral narrative, I think. So, but it does bring me to this, and I sort of, I mentioned this at the beginning of the answer, but, when I was doing my research, I went to Montana to on Bighorn Mountain, and took some time to figure out kind of where everything was supposed to be, and where my scenes would take place, and I had these Native American guides, because you can't go on the reservation land without them, and as I was walking, through this sort of mountainous area with them, I was listening to them tell stories about their culture, and about the way that they were raised, and about the ways that um, they were taught about themselves. And I thought to myself, my God, this sounds all really familiar to me. Like, it felt very familiar to me. And they they took me after the tour was over. After they took me around, and they said, "Oh, we want to make sure that you get some fry bread, before you leave." And they took me to this place, and they thought they were giving me something that I'd never had, except for it was bake, people. It was just bake. And I thought to myself, isn't this fascinating? Like, I'm here. They have this thing that they think is so special, and we have this thing that is so special to us, and it's the same thing. So anyway, I know that didn't answer your question, but I left feeling like it was such a wonderful moment for me of connection.
No, you're right. Your writing becomes borderline poetic when you're writing about the natural environment. I was fascinated by that. And I was wondering whether you noticed that you were doing that. Um, and if you did notice and deliberately do it, why is that?
Paula, I don't know if it was deliberate. I think that I'm a naturalist. I think that I believe and crave and desire and all of nature and all of natural beauty. I mean, so at those moments where I'm writing about it, I'm usually if I'm writing a scene that has anything to do with nature, I've seen it. I don't like just imagine it. Like, I go and I look at a tree, or I go and try to find that flower, or I stand in that area. And so those particular moments where I'm writing about nature is because I'm in that moment at the time, and it's having that particular effect on me. So if it's written, and I am not a poet, let me tell you, but if it's written with a sense of like beauty, it's because I'm in awe.
Yeah, I wanted to circle back a little bit to something you said earlier. You were talking about doing research. I kind of wondered if you would be willing to share sort of how you constructed the time period. You mentioned reading some Eric Williams, and I wondered what were the sort of historical sources you used to kind of get into that particular time period, because you're quite specific. Every chapter begins with an exact year and even a month, and so we know exactly where we are historically, which I love because I teach history. Chronology is important, um,
Yeah.
and also because you're backing and forth as well. So yeah, could you talk us a little bit through your kind of process of finding the right period for this story?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it kind of goes back to the first question, about sort of choosing that time right when the British were going to arrive, and I wanted to just sort of start a little bit so you could kind of see what the island looked like under Spanish rule, and then how it changed when the British arrived, and there was a very significant change, and I began to sort of find documents that detailed how exactly these things changed. Some of that was Eric Williams has, and we're so lucky to have had him as an intellect from the Caribbean, because he really gave us so much by sort of laying the groundwork for us. And so from there, I launched into sort of researching things about sort of the way that the Spanish did slavery and the way that the British did slavery. And I wanted to show how unsettling that could be to a family who had been changed from one to the other. And you can see that in I think in this family. But from the North American side, I found one of the characters, who's a very minor character in the story. Um, One of my main characters meets him sort of on his way from Canada down into North America, and he's a real life person. And he happened to be a naturalist, a botanist, an astronomer. Like, he was all these things, and he'd left behind an 800-page manual um, of like his entire trek from sort of Canada through Idaho all the way down. And so for that part of the novel, I followed his trek, and I had one of my main characters, Cretan, meet up with him at a particular time in exactly the place where Rosa will eventually end up going. So I used what I could find in the documents, and I had these people, and even with Edward Rose, I knew the times when he was doing certain things with the crow, and so I just want to tell you that it's really hard. And you do not get extra bonus points for writing historical fiction. Like, I don't get like a pat on the back. So if
You
you
do from
see
me, Lauren. You do from
okay, well,
me.
thank you.
Yeah?
But I'm telling you, like, historical novelists who are really like trying to hold on to facts, like, it's a lot of weaving, a lot of braiding, and you're trying to make sure that you don't lie, and that you're not giving, that you're able to give people like you, Keswa, like, the ability to sort of type it into the computer and find more information, because that's the whole goal, right? Is to actually get people to sort of dig deeper and ask their own questions and look for more. So I had fun with it at times, but Hilary Mantel is sort of my guiding light of historical fiction, and she really believes that, like, you can't change facts for your book. And so I tried really hard not to change, as facts as we know it, dates, times, months, those things. And I tried to work my fiction around those places. And so I had a box that I was operating in. And it's not always easy, because you want things to happen, and they can't always happen when you want them to happen. So
No, you do it wonderfully. And like I said, this is the kind of book that goes on my reading list, and I tell my students they should read it as they're trying to understand the Caribbean, because it is anchored in enough truth that it's actually useful. So thank you.
thanks very much.
And I suppose, like, building on that, Lauren, I know you mentioned that it was released like in the height of the pandemic, and so everything was sort of virtual. But then you attended Bocas this year, and I was wondering, what was the general feedback that you got, especially from the Trinidadians who've read your book?
Yeah, that was really nice. I mean, first of all, to be sort of holed up in my house for, the year or 2 years, after this book came out, and not really actually get to be with readers in the way that I could for my first book. But I have to say, if I'm being completely honest, which I probably shouldn't say, um, I don't think that Till the Well Runs Dry was received as well in Trinidad. And I remember being like, I wonder how come people don't like this book back home. And the American audience loved it, right? Like it's a and the West Indian Americans loved it, but in Trinidad itself, I don't know if people loved it as much. So I didn't really expect this book to be any different. Like I was sort of like, okay, clearly they don't like me. So classic author thing. They don't like me. So when this book came out, I started getting notes from people and letters from people back home who were like, I didn't know this, or this is the most I'd ever learned about sort of what was going on in the Caribbean at this time. And I'd never seen anything quite like this done before. And there were so many people who came up to me at Bocas who were just like, your novel is one of my favorites. And it made me feel so good, particularly because I felt like it was a story that I wrote for the Caribbean readers, for people in the Caribbean, for people like me that just needed to understand a little bit more about sort of where we came from, how we got here, who we were. So it felt like a little bit of a love letter, and so the fact that they received it felt really good. Yeah, thank you, Roger, for asking.
That was wonderful. No, let me take you back to the novel itself. The novel places considerable focus on insecurity in several forms. There are threats to physical safety, threats to material well-being, and in the case of Rosa, Victor, and Creighton Rampley, the individuals question their own worth. So I was wondering whether it was intentional, this theme of insecurity, or whether it just developed organically as the story revealed itself to you.
Yeah, no, it was very intentional. One of the things that and I mentioned this before, but when we're talking about colonialism, like colonialism is made for us to feel this way, right? Like it's set up, it's a whole system designed to make us feel unsure about who we are, unsure about our culture, about our skin, about our everything is meant to question us. And so I don't know if I could write a book about this time and not thread it with these moments of insecurity, financial, physical, emotional, psychological. Like it all had to be in there. And I hope at the end of the book that you can see all the ways that every character sort of works through that moment. And I hope that at the end of the book you can see that community and familial love and those things that are rooted in who we are as African people comes through. But I had to take us through that. I mean, it was important. It was an important sort of narrative arc for every character to sort of feel that uncertainty because of the nature of and the brutality of what we suffered and what we continue to suffer.
I really appreciated the fact that you seem to have made a point of speaking about hair and insecurity surrounding hair, like Rosa's insecurity about her hair. And then Victor, you had this very loving scene where Rosa was putting oil in Victor's hair and making him feel the interaction made him realize that his hair was something to celebrate. I really, really appreciated it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you know whether we're light or dark and have curly hair and or straight hair or whatever, like as people of African descent, we all go through something. Like we all go through it. Whether it's our skin, and we go through it in our families, and we go through it in our communities. And so it's hard to write a communal familial novel with us and not to be honest about those things and how they upend us and how they harm us, and how we have to sort of scrap our way out of it and it kind of goes back to the whole colonialism thing. We are having, even now, we have to learn over and over again how to love ourselves, in the face of all that's meant to assault our senses about who we are. I don't know when we're going to get over that, but the anti-blackness continues, and as it continues, we have work to do, and we have to do it with our children, and we have to do it with our nieces and our nephews, and we just and with all the people who are in our community to remind them, of the love and their own beauty.
Yeah, the word that sort of pops out to me when I hear you talk about that is really healing. And the scene that Paul has described in particular, it's full of healing, right? Where we see his mother touch his hair and him feel well in the kind of larger sense of the word. And I guess playing again off the word, the kind of earlier conversation about insecurity and comparison. Um, is there any sense for you that, and without giving any too much away, the way the story ends with the unresolved, there's no way to do this without spoiling it. But we don't know certain things about certain characters at the end of the novel. And so is that a kind of nods to the continued insecurity? Um, or is it the kind of hope for healing that you leave us with? This question is very well formed, as you can tell. But I'm kind of asking about
It
both
is, it is,
healing
it
and
is.
insecurity in one very tidy question.
Ah, yeah, no, what I think, I wanted you to leave with is not feeling insecure as much as hopeful. You know, from the standpoint of someone who lives or lived with people who left their home, for a new home. There is this always a sense that um, always a sense of hope looking forward and hope looking backward. And I think that at the end of the novel, even though things are unresolved, and you don't get to see some of the characters we grow attached to, I think leaving it quiet is a way to fill that void with hopefulness that everything worked out, that everything is worked out the way that it was supposed to work out, and not insecurity. Yeah, I don't even like to think of the insecurity part, because I really have like my whole idea of what is going on back home that worked out well. Yeah.
Then I guess I'll come back to the question of healing, and I guess it feels like it's something of a minor theme, right? It's a minor theme. It's something that happens, and I wondered if that's a thread in other works that you've done as well. Like you talked a little bit about your previous novel, and is it something we can expect to see in future novels as well, and why?
Um, yeah, I think so. I mentioned this earlier, but there is this, you know, if we believe that, whether you believe that you've lived many lives or lived only one, like the fact is that we're going through this journey trying to sort of get to a better place, and we're hoping to have healing um, at the end of it, no matter what you've gone through. So the moment with Victor and his mother touching his hair, is giving him armor for that moment where the girl makes fun of his hair. And that moment where Edward Rose tells Rosa that she's beautiful, right? Is that moment that sort of heals all those other moments where she's, at the wedding, at her sister's wedding, and people are remarking about her ugliness and her unattractiveness. Like, so I did deliberately have those moments of sort of marked healing, those moments where if we're watching, it actually happens for most of us, right? Like if we're paying attention to the signals in our lives, there are things that we've been broken, and someone or something comes along to heal it. And if you're willing and able to see it, it can heal you. So, in my previous novel, it was a lot about heartbrokenness, and family ties that are complex. And I have this woman who has this terrible secret, and she must be healed at the end from carrying this burden that is not hers, by the way. Like, it was not a shameful burden that she should have been carrying the way that she carried. But yeah, I think that's going to be in every novel. Although I do have one on the shelf that the healing doesn't seem so healing. But anyway.
uh, quite a powerful moment there. You had me, slightly emotional. You're speaking about being broken, and trying to find healing. But I wanted to bring up something that we discussed in our review, that the whole concept of gender roles. And here you had Rosa challenging the typical gender roles that you would expect for a woman in the late 1700s, early 1800s. What did you want to accomplish with that, particularly when you juxtapose her situation with Jeremiah's?
Yeah. Well, first, I did want a nod to give a nod to sort of that feeling that I think these young people think are new, which is new, which is, that there have always been girls who felt uncomfortable in girlhood. And there'll always be boys who feel uncomfortable in boyhood. And the question is about constraints, right? I mean, when you think about Ferosa, I mean, she's a girl of the land. She's a horse girl, and she is the most capable child of this family to take over this farm. And yet, what is in her way? The laws, British laws about what can be passed down. Her father knows it. Everybody in that house knows it, and yet she is confined by law, by societal's rules, and it feels unfair. And I wanted to put that on the page. I wanted to just have a little bit of a little moment where we get to see this girl sort of that I hope fall in love with, and see how how patently unfair it all is, for her to be as restricted and as um, and as um, and as put down as she is, given how capable she is. So I wanted that on the page. I also, I think it was really important to, I love on some level, I love how the young people are living today. You know what I mean? And how they just sort of refuse to be in our little boxes. It makes me uncomfortable sometimes too, because I'm like, but I admire it, and I think Rosa inhabits that spirit of like, I just want to be me.
In the novel, both Victor and Rosa find out very things about their parents that make them very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Um, and in fact, Rosa says to Victor, ignorance is wasted on the young and on the stupid, something to that effect.
Yeah.
um, and what I got a sense through while I was reading the novel, that you were urging your readers to extend some grace to their parents.
Hmm.
I don't know whether I was projecting, or whether you meant that, or whether you did so without noticing that you were doing it. So talk us through that.
Oh boy, this is a therapy session. Shoot. Let's see. Yeah. I mean, listen. There are not there are situations and parental situations that are not healthy for us, and we must extract ourselves from certain things. But generally speaking, our parents are growing at the same time we are growing. As human beings, we're all evolving. It's just that they're, a few years ahead of you, but they're still on their path, their journey. And yeah, I think as you get older, you begin to see how many of those mistakes, those flaws that you're so intolerant of, are just part of sort of them working through their own stuff. What I was really trying to do with Damas and the entire family is to just give enough of each member of that family, particularly the parents, to so that you could understand how they were shaped, how they became who they were, and how it affected their children. but also to show you that when Rosa becomes that mother, you know, that she too sort of brings with her all of that baggage, all of that stuff, and she's looking for her child to understand her, not just as a mother, but eventually, as she begins to tell him the story, eventually as a human being. And frankly, we cannot expect our children and our nieces and our nephews to see us unless we are honest with them about our journey. And I think that was for me the most important part of this book is we we Caribbean people like to keep secrets, and we like to hide our past from our children, and that there is a time and a place for that, but there does come a time and a place where we have to be more open, and we have to let them in. And I think that Rosa struggles with that at the beginning, but she's set free by that, and her child is able to love her differently because he knows her story.
I know it's Tessa's turn, but I really want to ask this question.
Yeah.
This is really important to me. I really wanted to know. Um, the mask is multilingual. He speaks English, he speaks French, he speaks Spanish. But when there's this huge confrontation between himself and Grayson, he curses him in Igbo. Why was it important to you to have the mask curse Grayson in Igbo?
Yeah. I don't even, I remember writing that scene and thinking to myself, like, you know, in some respects, like, and this goes back to talking about sort of colonialism and the constraints. Um, this man is a threat to his physical safety, to his family's safety, and Damas has all the language. He has the Spanish, he has the French, he has the English, he has all this language to use, and yet he can't use it because of the potential consequences of that of using this language. And so, but there's this rage and this sense of indignity that he must express somehow and in some way. And we know from a little snippet in the story that that he knows his story of how his family got to the island. So we know that he's at least seen a forefather who is from West Africa. And so when I thought of that moment, I thought to myself, what could he do other than like he wants to punch this man in the face, but what could he do that would make him feel this relief, and also be able to sort of give language to how he's feeling. So he says, so he curses him, may you be cursed, you fool, you know and yeah, I don't know how to explain that moment other than I needed him to have some release.
Okay, well, Paula stole my last question, so I'll ask a different question. Um, but I also add a little. I actually had add on a bit of to the last question, which was, you mentioned French, English, and Spanish. Did you consider using Creole? Because I know that the characters kind of come from Martinique to an extent. I wondered if
Yeah.
you'd kind of thought about that. And the second
Yeah.
question
Okay.
is,
Hmm.
sorry.
No
The second
worries.
one is completely separate. Is what can we expect from your next book?
Oh yeah.
Are you able? What are you able to tell us about it? So feel free to
Yeah,
do them both.
yeah. No, these are actually hard questions. Yeah. So, did I consider Creole? Yes, I did because um, obviously these characters were come. The mother comes from Martinique. What I wanted to do with that, though, in particular, was to show her haughtiness, which is why I sort of chose a more standard French, if that makes any sense. Like she believes that she is all of that. So, and she's trying to raise her children to sort of be as dignified as she believes herself to be. And yes, she married sort of a farmer, but she married a sort of a farmer who was malleable in her mind, and so and who had ambition, and so I use the sort of more formalized French to sort of, mark that. But I did have a question. Like I was sort of like, what should I do here? Um, but I mean, obviously everything's written in English anyway, so I could have said it. I could have said they were speaking in Creole, but I did want to make to mark the class of that particular person, that character. Um, and y'all don't have enough time for me to talk about next books because it's so complex. I thought I was actually going to be working on another historical novel, but I've been working with an editor who wants me to work on something that's not quite so historical anymore, and it's a book that I wrote during the pandemic. Back in 1996, I lived in South Africa, and if you know about that time, it was just at the end of apartheid, and they were having the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, and I was lucky or unlucky enough to sit through that when I was in Joburg, and I came back home with like piles of my notes from there, and during the pandemic I went into my little basement and found those notes and decided to write a story about that time.
Why was your
So
editor telling you to not do that? That sounds like
So
an amazing story that I want to read.
yeah, no, this is the story that she does want me to do. It's the story that I was actually planning on coming out with later, which was a story about sort of Baltimore in 1919 and da 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 da. But that book just is not working, and I can't figure out what's wrong with it. Like it just is not coming together. So I put it aside, and I gone and written another book, and I thought she was going to want to work with me on the Baltimore book, and she was like, no, 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 we'll do that later. Let's work on this one. So I think this is the next book. I think.
We're definitely looking forward to it. We've had a lovely conversation here. I think we could go on for hours, but unfortunately, we have to bring it to an end. Thank you so much for joining us, Lauren.
Thank you.
It was a lovely conversation. The next time our viewers see us, we'll be reflecting on Merle Collins's Ocean Stirrings. Yes.
I love
So
that book.
thank you for joining us and have a lovely day.
Thank you.